Hi everybody, welcome back to English 229. This is for class for Monday, the 20th of September. And last class we were talking a little bit about H.P. Lovecraft and some of his thoughts about the genre of horror and supernatural literature. In his introduction, this would be in page 12, at least of the version I'm using, the first sentence is, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. And then he continues on page 13 saying, the unknown, being likewise the unpredictable, became for our primitive forefathers a terrible and omnipotent source of boons and calamities visited upon mankind for cryptic and wholly extraterrestrial reasons. And then on page 15, he talks about the weird tale, that it's something more than secret murders or bloody bones or a sheeted form clanking chains according to rule. There's a certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread, of outer unknown forces that must be present. And there must be a hint, expressed with the seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject, of the most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. And he ends on page 16 saying, atmosphere is the all-important thing, for the final criteria of authenticity is not the dovetailing of a plot, but the creation of a given sensation. We may say, as a general thing, that a weird story whose intent is to teach or produce a social effect, or one in which the horrors are finally explained away by natural means, is not a genuine tale of cosmic fear. But it remains a fact that such narratives often possess, in isolated sections, atmospheric touches which fulfill every condition of a weird supernatural horror literature. Therefore, we must judge a weird tale not by the author's intent, nor by the mere mechanics of the plot, but by the emotional level which it attains at its least mundane point. If the proper sensations are excited, such a high spot must be admitted on its own merits as weird literature, no matter how it is later dragged down. The one test of the really weird is simply this, whether or not there be excited in the reader a profound sense of dread and of contact with unknown spheres and powers, a subtle attitude of awed listening, as if for the beating of black wings or the scratching of outside shapes and entities on the known universe's utmost ring. And we'll see whether or not Lovecraft is able to live up to that when we read some of his short stories, as we will later on in the semester. But in terms of the Gothic tradition, we're beginning chronologically, and that means that our first major Gothic text happens to be Frankenstein. And you can see in the notes below, I've included a link where you can access the text through Project Gutenberg if you weren't able to get a text of your own. And I just wanted to give a little bit of introduction about Frankenstein. Written by Mary Shelley, who happens to be the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, a very famous feminist. Mary Shelley was also the wife of Percy Shelley, a name you might be familiar with, a very famous romantic poet. And the story was written as part of a horror story competition where she was traveling with Percy and a few friends, and they were experiencing some bad weather, so they needed a way to entertain themselves. And they decided that what they would do is try to write ghost stories and see who could write the most frightening story. And out of that night, two very important Gothic tales were birthed. The first being Frankenstein, which was out of a dream that Mary Shelley had about the very famous creation scene that she fleshed out into her text. One of her traveling companions, named Dr. Polidori, wrote a short story entitled The Vampire, which is believed to have helped inspire Bram Stoker's very famous Gothic text, Dracula, which we will talk about a little bit more when we get a little bit closer to Dracula itself. Now, Shelley's husband, Percy, edited and suggested that Mary Shelley expand on her tale, which is what she did. There's been some controversy associated with this as to how much of this story could really be attributed to Mary Shelley if her husband helped to edit it and also gave her suggestions for expansion. I've always seen this as a little bit of sexism, to be quite honest with you, because I think if it was the other way around, we wouldn't necessarily have these concerns. It's not at all unusual for authors to get editorial suggestions and help in the writing process. So I don't see that as any way unusual with what happened with Mary Shelley. Now, some of the passages, if you've started already reading Frankenstein, you'll see there are these long descriptions of nature, and the Romantic movement was known for its descriptive elements of nature and the natural world and how that created or how that related to the human world. So I suspect that that was part of the expansion, but nevertheless, those passages are just as important as the passages of action. So that's a little bit of a hint in terms of your reading. Though Frankenstein probably achieved its height of popularity in the 1930s, when Universal Studios made a film out of it, and it's become part of our popular culture. That film is in many ways a very different tale than Mary Shelley wrote, not too surprisingly, since Hollywood oftentimes to simplify things and also tries to condense things to fit within the format of what is considered to be acceptable for a feature film, usually between 1 to 2 hours. Frankenstein is an hour and 10 minutes or so. So I've always said that they should be viewed as two independent stories that have value and worth as independent pieces. But it was that film, even though Frankenstein has never been out of print, it was that film that I think helped to cement this image that we've got of the Frankenstein creature. And it's an image that's very different than what Mary Shelley gave in the text, which you might already know if you've started reading the text. And I had indicated that ideally what would happen is that when we begin our unit on Frankenstein, which is now, you would have the novel read in its entirety. That said, I'm also a realist, and I understand that it may not necessarily be possible. We've got multiple classes devoted to Frankenstein. And I thought what we could do for this first class for Frankenstein is actually watch that 1931 film Frankenstein by James Whale, which is an hour and 10 minutes. Now, you can rent the film on places like Amazon Prime or YouTube. I was able to find the film for free. However, it comes with the soundtrack if you are watching this link. Do note that when Frankenstein was originally released, it didn't have a soundtrack, and I think that's important in terms of being able to appreciate some of what was going on within the film. So I think that the soundtrack, while it helps to establish mood, it also is not necessarily the filmmaker's version. But if you aren't able to rent Frankenstein in its original format, or you don't already have a copy of Frankenstein in its original format, you can watch it on the link below on Vimeo. Again, remembering that that soundtrack would not have been part of the original experience. And again, when you view this film, view it as a separate story as opposed to the text. It's loosely based on the text, but very loosely indeed. And I thought what we could do is actually talk a little bit about that film in our attendance question. And then next class, we could talk more about the actual novel itself. And when we get to the ending of our Frankenstein unit is when you would have your first writing assignment due. And that's going to be a journal, an informal response to the text Frankenstein. Certainly you can make references to the film as well if you'd like. And I'm thinking about a page of reflections and thoughts and questions. It doesn't have any particular kind of format. Basically, think of it as a kind of conversation on paper that you and I would be having. And that will be due on the 29th, Wednesday, at 11:59 p.m. or previous, because that basically is when we will have concluded with Frankenstein. Though keep in mind, if you need an extension, you can always ask for one. I'm asking that you send those journals and all your writing assignments to me via PDF, because that works best with my grading program, to my email, which is ruiz, Ruiz, @gcc.mass.edu. And you can include anything that I'm discussing in the class videos, or anything that your classmates are discussing in the discussion forum. So all of that is considered part of the class experience that can help inform your thinking about Frankenstein. And we'll talk a little bit more about the journals as the semester progresses. But now that we've gotten into our first major Gothic text, I wanted you to begin thinking about how you would proceed with writing those journals. Sometimes students like to take notes as they are reading. Sometimes students like to wait until they're done with the actual text itself and then take notes. Sometimes students want to wait until they've had the class discussions and the class presentations and then put together a journal response. Whatever seems to make the most sense for you. And it can be as long or as short as you'd like it to be. And certainly you'll have the opportunity to write more on Frankenstein, if you so choose, when we get to the point of the semester when we're talking about writing papers, where you could do a 4 or 5 page analysis about something in particular in relation to Frankenstein. But at this point, think of the journals as just kind of like your note-taking and your thoughts and your observations. And I'm grading them informally on a checkmark system in light of that. And I'm not grading for grammar or mechanics, just for content. Again, you can think about it as a kind of conversation on paper. So we will be talking about the novel next class, and we will continue to do so until the 29th. And then we will move forward to post short stories. And if you'll remember what I was telling you, what I hoped ideally is that when we are talking about one text in class, you are at home reading the next text so that you can have it read in its entirety when we talk about it in class, or as much as possible. So today's attendance question, because I wanted to leave you with actually watching the film, and that's due in our class discussion forum on the 21st, which is Tuesday at 8 a.m. Again, if you need an extension, please ask me. I'll be happy to grant it to you. But your attendance question for our discussion forum is, did you like or dislike the 1930s film version of Frankenstein, and why? My suspicion is most of you have not seen the film, but if you have seen the film, watching it with a more critical eye this time around, more than just for entertainment. But I've found that while most people know about the 1930s Frankenstein and have a vague conception of a square head with bolts that a breakfast cereal has been named after, Frankenberry, they really don't have an experience with watching the film, let alone with reading the text. So I wanted us to have both of those experiences. So I hope you are doing well. I am doing well, and next class we will begin talking about Frankenstein, and we will begin at the very beginning, the name Frankenstein itself. So again, I hope you're well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.